The talk is called Deconstructing Sociotechnical Identity in Maker Culture, and the first author is Andrea Marshall, who is a PhD candidate at Drexel University. And again, I'm still me, and I'm still at UCL. Okay. So again, the slides have been tweeted, and if for some reason you all start having trouble hearing Andrea, let me know and I can try to help her out because I have the notes here as well. Are you ready, Andrea?
I'm ready.
Okay. So in this paper, we argue that makers engage in various degrees of sociotechnical identity formation. We explore the role of gender in maker identity formation and how masculine characteristics of the maker create challenges for feminine identity construction and expression. Our ethnographic study of computer clubs in Germany with our colleagues Volker Wolf and Konstantin, who you just saw up here, and Anna Weibert and all the rest of them, indicate that children as makers synthesize gender and technical identities within the context of STEAM. And STEAM, again, is science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. So they synthesize gender within these STEAM building activities. Our research is a meta-analysis of the data collected in an ethnographic study supervised by Wolf. And our work applies the framework that you heard in the previous talk just recently to looking at children's identity construction and how we can create a generative theory of understanding how feminine skill building can be both visible and demonstrative within formation of computing cultures. So in order to do that, Andrea is going to start by first examining socio-technical identity formation within the context of our research. Andrea?
Thank you, Jen. Thanks very much. So to continue, while researchers have discussed gender issues in maker culture, and still others have focused on individual makers and might create their socio-technical identities, scholars in our domain of HCI have not yet discussed in depth how an individual maker's gender and technical identity are co-constructed in concert with one another. Here, our work proposes to do so, extending the findings of an earlier qualitative study of children's makerspaces and making practices. Our earlier findings included some discussion of gender, but not a detailed discussion of how makers construct their own gendered and technical identities. We'll analyze the data using the model that Dr. Rowe just discussed, since it's an applicable frame that allows us to view the varied nuances of how gender and technical identity are co-constructed as a locus of interaction between makers and technology. And further, I'll discuss the model in more detail within the context of our work. So to continue, we chose to study makerspaces as they are a vital venue for recruiting people into STEM, science, technology, engineering, and science, by giving them exposure to new technology. We selected children's makerspaces in particular as they allowed us to explore gender and technology identity construction at a formative stage. Thus, in our paper, we want to apply this model to the makerspace. We are going to demonstrate that the model is appropriate for discussing makerspaces, and further, by using it, we're going to be able to present our findings regarding children's makerspace usage. The model will also allow us to show how individual makers have unique ways of engaging with and expressing gender and their experiences, as well as attitudes toward technology. This identity construction that occurs at the locus of gender and technical knowledge is in response to social pressures. And in order to better understand these social pressures, I'm going to discuss our method next. This paper is an extension of an analysis of earlier data within three makerspaces in Germany. These groups were actually weekly and lasted for 90 minutes a week for 5 weeks total. We worked with both girls and boys aged 8 to 12 years of age. And around the age of 8 to 12 is when girls actually lose interest in computing, as earlier work has shown. These makerspaces were called Come In and have been going on for about 4 to 7 years average. In addition to creating a fun environment to learn skill building, the key goal of these spaces was to encourage children from a mixture of German and immigrant backgrounds to collaborate as a cohesive community. Our mixed gender sample was essential to our understanding of maker identity, as well as user agency in children, with particular attention paid to feminine skill building such as showing, aesthetic decision-making, and graphic design, since these are often invisible and invalidated in traditional learning spaces as well as computing environments. The informal and flexible nature of the activity supported creativity as well as peer collaboration. Furthermore, these have been identified as components which foster the development of both user agency and computational self-efficacy. The children soon applied creativity and collaboration as two major cognitive tools of gender presentation and self-efficacy. The ethnographic study that was conducted actually involved participatory observation. Within HCI, participatory observation is one way in which feminist scholars such as Ann Light have acknowledged we can support a, quote, non-essentialist position on the formation of identity, unquote. This is in order to discover both agency and identity in tandem with one another. Furthermore, we designed interventions for our mixed sample of children to better understand how we might, as Light has observed, quote, create a space that is flexible enough to keep the discussion open as to who we might turn out to be, unquote. Participatory observation is a conventionally applied anthropological ethnographic method within our field that's both reflexive and qualitative. Our club activities in all field sites applied participatory observation, as we'll discuss in more detail. Okay. It is critical to establish that the French term bricolage, learning by doing, a term first introduced to HCI by Blackwell in 2006, occurs in a highly gendered context. Through Blackwell's work explicitly identifies it as a masculinist pursuit of tinkering. With an asymmetrical counterpart, he actually says to be known as, in French, science d'essayage, as a feminized form of experimental play. We argue that bricolage can be applied as a practice to a gendered spectrum in the context of both the maker ethos as well as the sociotechnical constructions of identity. Feminist scholars outside of HCI, such as Judith Butler, have argued that binary gender roles are both problematic and restrictive. She observes that masculinist hierarchies of gender insist upon heteronormative dimensions that ultimately refuse to acknowledge, quote, whatever biological intractability sex appears to have, gender is culturally constructed. Hence, gender is neither the cause or result of sex, nor is seemingly fixed as sex, unquote. Varied and non-binary structures of gender identity formation can be construed as separate from biological sex taxonomies. Technology as masculine culture conventionally insists upon gendered binaries that in fact privilege both socially masculine identities and biological male expression. These binaries inherently support heteronormative restrictions that ignore a diverse spectrum of gendered maker personae. And to further our investigation into bricolage as a feminine maker practice and gendered perspective, I'm going to discuss the relationship between bricolage and maker values. Contemporary scholarly discussions in HCI support the perspective that maker culture actually promotes the idea that makers generate, quote, their creations ultimately for humans first and efficiency after, which is why they watch how people resonate with their creations, discussing recently catalyzing events contagiously and sharing immediately, even especially with kinks still in the design. This leads to viral reproduction of ideas and creations where mutation, not replication, is the normal expectation, as Silver 2009 observes. This has been examined from the perspective of STEAM, educational principles explored by many scholars, particularly with regards to children's development of technical self-efficacy through playful engagements with technology, and how these interventions are linked to gendered sociotechnical identity formation. Shuri Turkle has observed, as of 2011, that, quote, discoveries are made into a concrete ad hoc fashion and only later are recast into, quote, canonically accepted formalisms, unquote. So we can understand that children's ability to creatively interact with technology through leisurely activities can also be used to examine and disrupt these restrictive paradigms surrounding binary gender with regard to both gender expression, self-efficacy, and identity formation. I'm going to discuss our findings next. And to discuss it in light of our model, There are three aspects of technical identity, technical ability, self-efficacy, and presentation of agency were all relevant to this discussion. Technical ability in our fieldwork included whether students knew how to program, sew, or draw. All children were taught to draw basic shapes and came up with project ideas, was certainly within their abilities too. Various students asserted that they could not draw or not sew in the beginning, yet later many students demonstrated these same abilities. The question is whether they lacked the confidence they were able to do this correctly in terms of self-efficacy, or if they were engaged in a presentation of agency and posturing they could not do it for some social reasons such as learned helplessness. Consider the boy who, on considering whether to join the wholly female craft soft circuit group, said, "I can't draw, I can't sew, I'm not going there, no way." It's difficult for us to know what the true motivation was for this outburst. Did he actually not have these skills or a lack of technical ability? Did he lack did he see himself actually as less capable than he was? And this could be because he wanted to set expectations so low he did not disappoint, or perhaps do not want to appear unmasculine. Only careful ethnographic work over a longer period of time than the study here includes would fully explain these issues. We endeavor to investigate this further in our work. Ultimately, our findings were based on 3 makerspaces and 3 separate clubs. And our paper discusses both the fieldwork and the activities more in depth. Finally, we posit gender inauthenticity can be a problem for some women in maker culture. Not all women engage in more normative expressions of feminine individual gender identity, but many, perhaps even the majority, do so. While we are arguing for a place for women with feminine gender identities, it is equally important that people with all types of non-binary gender identities feel welcome. Thus, our goal is to demonstrate the terminology put forth in Rodenpohl's sociotechnical model of the co-construction of technical and gender identity to assist us in characterizing the tensions that go on in maker culture. We've shown how gender identity construction occurs in response to the factors on the individual, symbolic, and structural gender levels. Further, we've also expressed that technical identity is complex and that a full understanding of technical ability, self-efficacy, and a presentation of gender are required to truly understand how individuals respond to technology. These gender and technical identity constructions occur in concert. We also emphasize that teasing out these factors is critical to addressing the gender equity issues in maker culture, which in turn might attract more women to maker culture and by proxy STEAM.
Thank you, Andrea. So in the slide deck, which we've tweeted out, we've included our works cited. They're, of course, also in the paper. And with that, I'll take any questions, as will Andrea.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a lot of time for questions now. So, who wants to start first? We start here. Now in the middle. Second.
You said you had 3 German groups.
Yeah, we
Children makers places. Can you tell me where, in which region you
Sure.
were?
Andrea, why don't you go through some of the extra details we had on slide 6 that you that we didn't include in this version of the talk?
Sure. So let me see.
So I
I'm
don't
sorry,
know if you can see up there, but that's a map of where Volker's computer clubs are. And go ahead.
No, I was going to say I didn't hear the question. I'm having a little bit
Oh,
of
I'm
trouble.
sorry. Can you? She wanted to know details about the 3 makerspaces.
just in which region? Was
Okay, so the
Northern,
first one
Southern?
was in a grammar school in a large city in the Rhineland area. It was. Do you want more details? I can tell you more. Founded in 2009 with 14 children. They're largely Turkish, Lebanese, Afghanistan, and Russian. 6 girls, 8 boys, ages 8 to 12. Makerspace B is a primary school in one of the large cities in the Ruhr area. And the immigrant backgrounds present in this community's mirror the diversity of the surrounding neighborhood. Here, we often had children stemming from Turkey, Albania, Macedonia, Tunisia, and Morocco. And again, we had a gender mix, 5 girls, 5 boys, ages 8 to 10. And then finally, Makerspace C is an elementary school in a mid-sized town in the Siegerland area, so close to Siegen. And the participants resembled the cultural diversity of the neighborhood. Half of these participants were German, and the rest were Turkish or from Eastern or Southern Europe. We had 2 boys and 7 girls, ages 8 through 10.
I think they were 8 through 10. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
And we had them doing a range of different e-textile activities.
So my question is also about a little bit more detail. So you had this one example of this boy getting upset about the implication that he might know how to sew or something. And so maybe you have a number more examples to show the different types of gender identity construction that the kids engaged in.
Andrea, did you hear that? The professor was asking for another example of gender identity construction in addition to the young boy that said that he couldn't sew, and he said he couldn't draw, but then he spent the rest of the afternoon telling the girls how to draw and giving them advice, which we found fascinating.
Yeah, I think in some instances there were issues where the girls at first were a little uncomfortable with the more technical elements in these activities, but demonstrated confidence happened over time, and also the collaboration between boys and girls happened over time gradually too. So you could see not only a building of gender identity in terms of how they expressed collaboration and peer cooperation to one another, but also how they engaged in gendered skill building, both with regard to technical self-efficacy, but also the feminized soft skills of drawing, sewing, and aesthetic decision-making.
Another example might be in Club B, where we had them do the Spark Fun Bunny Bright electronics kit. It's an adorable kit. Basically, you solder a circuit board, which you stuff in a bunny rabbit. You make like a stuffed rabbit. And there is a magnet that operates the reed switch in the bunny's belly. And you also solder on a battery and an LED. And we saw a lot of hesitation initially, especially from the smaller people who primarily were girls, because the tools were just too big for their hands. We tried to find smaller scaled tools, but you have a girl about that height trying to use soldering irons, and because the children were so small, Constantine and I spent the time. Constantine was in the field with us, although he have to be held accountable for this paper. Was actually holding onto the soldering iron, and we had to develop a technique so that little people, particularly these tiny little girls, could use the wire cutters to cut the extra stuff off their circuit board, but we wanted to have them do it themselves. So we put their hands on it, and then we just gave them a little bit of pressure on the end because, they didn't have the physical strength, but, we wanted to help them out rather than do it for them. And there's an example of we saw a sense of this isn't for me. And that was unfortunate, and we were able to work through that. But it was interesting to realize that some of these tools don't really exist in sizes that are appropriate for some individuals.
That's true.
Did this answer your question? So
Did
you
she
want
say
more
not really?
like gender examples?
Yeah, so I'm wondering, this was again on a very abstract level, but what I'm wondering is about the operationalization of gendered remarks. So you have a number of videos probably of these kids' behaviors, and then you categorize them. So you classify the behaviors into certain gendered behaviors or,
Yes.
or constructing gender identities. And my concrete question would be what the examples are. So the example about the boy was, so there's a gender stereotypic stereotypical feminine task, and he gets upset about it. So he tries to distance himself from that. But what was your definition actually of gender in these behaviors?
What was our definition of gender?
So is anything that is not
an
confident
excellent question.
feminine, or so how did you actually classify these behaviors?
Andrea, do you want to take that?
Our definition of gender? Yeah, that's an excellent question, so thank you for that. I think in this instance, what we're trying to extrapolate is that gender is a spectrum rather than a binary construct, at least from our feminist perspective. And one of the arguments that we are making in this paper and in a majority of our work is that binary restrictions or heteronormative definitions of gender are too restrictive to actually explain the range of human behaviors that occur both within interactions with technology, but also in interactions with others. And because binary gender often privileges masculine social roles, masculine skill building, and masculinist perceptions of women's particularly technical ability, it's an asymmetrical interaction between sort of masculinist behaviors and feminized behaviors. And I think as a feminist, I worry that feminine behaviors particularly are devalued in a lot of traditional engineering and computing cultures. So we wanted to understand sort of how this begins at its inception. And so at the formative stage, when children are still discovering their social roles and things like social indoctrination, behavioral protocols, we wanted to understand through play specifically, because play is a really crucial form of learning and a really revealing form of learning, how both gender is expressed but also built over time through the interaction with both their peers, but also crucially through their interactions with technology, and to see how those skills, both masculine and feminine skill building, could be synthesized cognitively in creative and collaborative ways.
So to just add to that, those were the sorts of issues we were talking about. Because we weren't treating gender as a binary, we didn't really have a definition and attempt to code some behaviors as masculine and some behaviors as feminine. Instead, we just looked at examples of identity work.
Right.
And we weren't really trying to say this is masculine or this is feminine. We just wanted to look for identity work that had a gendered component, regardless of which of many genders.
That's right.
Okay, we'll go with one more question. If no one wants to ask, I will.
Oh, goody.
So, I had the pleasure to read the paper. So, I can ask some other questions. So, what I would like to know is, what are we doing with this kind of data now? So, in your future work and conclusion chapter, I was missing the future work part. So, what is the next step?
Andrea, did you catch that Constantine asserts that there's not an adequate formulation of your future work and asks what your future work...
I accept the challenge. He's thrown down the gauntlet like a good colleague would. Sure. So I think in future work, it's important for us to look at gender as a spectrum. And I would like to extend this work to looking at queer identity sociotechnical formation, which has a large spectrum that is sort of ever expanding, specifically in sort of queer STS studies. There's a lot of scholars looking at identity formation and skill building. There is an emergent area of literature in geospatial studies in terms of queer space and queer place that links to both identity formation, skill building, and cognitive function. And I think it's important to go beyond just the feminine constructions of gender, because although those are the ones that are obscured in computing cultures, we can expand it to even something like trans identity or, a romantic identity. I mean, there's so many things that we can look at there's so much rich nuance that we still haven't explored, and I'm really eager to study it.
And in addition to that, of course, I'm going to support Andrea's studies. But having relocated to a new university in Britain, I've discovered that the lily pad Arduino is now passé because, at least in Britain, I'm sad to say, because the British government has rolled out a new microprocessor in conjunction with the BBC microbit. So we're going to be, I and the students based in London are going to be replicating some of this research and looking at it in the context of this new government-sponsored tool, where they have sort of problematic representations of e-textiles that perhaps miss a desire to construct feminine gender identity. The textbook example for the BBC microbit is currently, Constantine, can you go like that in front of your face, under your hat? Yeah, is currently to hang a microbit like this under the hat and use it to display things outward. And my question is, what child that doesn't want to get beaten up is actually going to ever do that? But that's their idea of, and by the way, their example is a water sensing hat. It senses if it rains, and if it's going to rain, it tells you on the heads-up display that it's raining. So we need, as our colleague said earlier, challenging, interesting tasks, and maybe they don't need to be socially relevant, but they at least need to have a purpose. So we'll be looking at those technologies and a range of LGBT identities going forward. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.